June of 2021 marked a little known yet significant anniversary in U.S. history. The U.S. war on drugs turned an infelicitous 50. It is 5 decades, $1 trillion, and hundreds of thousands of lives later. Yet many are still asking, what were the real results? This week in our three-part series, we are pausing and reevaluating not only whether the war's costly means justified its ends, but also its tremendous impact on the Black community. All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
President Richard Nixon initiated the war on drugs in June of 1971 when he denounced drug abuse as public enemy number one. With this pronouncement, he catapulted the country into a decades-long stalemate founding largely on fallacious data, virulent biases against minorities, especially African Americans, and ill-calibrated policies. In July of 1971, Nixon created the Drug Enforcement Administration, otherwise known as the DEA, to consolidate government agencies and coordinate his war on drugs. Ronald Reagan followed Nixon's lead, and from 1981 to 1989, Reagan intensified the war through measures such as the 1984 Just Say No campaign, which was spearheaded by then First Lady Nancy Reagan, and the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which appropriated $1.7 billion to the anti-drug war. The attention and resources that the Reagan administration devoted to the war on drugs did little to curtail the use of drugs, but it did cause incarceration rates amongst African Americans to skyrocket. The government threw billions of dollars at prosecuting young, first-time, or non-violent drug policy offenders. Most of the people prosecuted under these strict policies were Blacks, even though African Americans weren't more likely to use or sell drugs. They were more likely to be arrested and incarcerated for drug offenses. The prosecutions of the 1980s destroyed the lives of thousands of Black men and women and decimated communities of color across this country. My first guest is Elaine White. Elaine is a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. She was a partner in a record store before she became addicted to crack. Her addiction caused her to spend over 30 years to involvement with the criminal justice system. Good morning and welcome to the show, Elaine. I think you're on mute, Elaine.
Oh, I'm sorry. Good morning.
No problem. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. First of all, I just want to say congratulations on your sobriety. And I just want to thank you so much for being willing to share your story. I want to start with you. You were a student at the University of North Carolina. You were studying political science. What were those days like, and what were you hoping to do after you graduated from college?
Well, I had hoped to go on to law school, which I did for one semester, but I had become caught up in the drugs at that time. So I only stayed one semester and decided to come home and open a record store.
Okay, so you ditched the law for the entertainment business. Tell us a little about that record store.
It was just a mom and pop's record store, but I had a lot of connections with promoters, record promoters in my area. So we did pretty well with it for a couple of years.
Okay, and was it during that time that you were running the record store that you got introduced to drugs?
Yes. Well, it was before the record store. Actually, it was while I was in college.
While you were in college. Okay. And would you say that while you were at the University of North Carolina, the drugs were pretty rampant on the campus during those years?
Yes, definitely.
And what years were those that you were at the university?
From 1974 to 1976.
Okay. And what drugs were you introduced to during that time?
Well, I had transferred from North Carolina Central University. I went there 2 years, and then I transferred to UNC Charlotte. Uh, there was a little weed smoking at Central, but at UNC Charlotte, there was cocaine and pills and all kinds of things. Hallucinates, acid, MDA, and all kinds of stuff.
Do you recall how you first, got introduced once you said you transferred to the UNC Charlotte campus? Like what was your first introduction?
It was like in the dorms. It was everywhere. Drugs were everywhere, and they had more resources and more money, so they were much more abundant than they were at North Carolina Central.
And when you say they, are you talking about the students at UNC?
No, the drugs. The drugs were more abundant.
Did you start with, say, like marijuana, just like, smoking weed, and then did it escalate, or where did you start?
Yes. Yeah. Well, weed was the first drug I had tried, and I wouldn't say escalated. I just tried something new, something different, and that was cocaine.
But you were able to graduate, even though at the time, were you using cocaine at the time you graduated?
Oh yes, I funded my college education selling weed.
Okay, so you went from using it, so at some point you started selling it on campus?
Yes, yes.
And like when you graduated, how big was your cocaine habit? Were you using it a lot or a little?
Oh, just a little when I graduated, but that escalated when the crack epidemic started, which was like in the like 76, 77.
And where were you living then? What city were you living in?
Charlotte.
Oh, you were in Charlotte. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And you said the crack epidemic just hit the city in 1976 or so.
Yeah.
What was it like? And when you say the epidemic started, were people in your family, people in your neighborhood, people in your community, were they, experimenting with crack?
Yeah. It started as a party thing, a fun thing, and nobody knew how devastating it was going to be after a little while. And then when more people started using it, and it became a problem with more and more people, and people became hostile, and it was just a big crazy thing because you couldn't get enough. Nobody could get enough. It worked on everybody the same way. It was always a saying: one is too many, and 1,000 ain't enough. So you would, once you started using it, you wouldn't stop. You wouldn't stop. You would go for days until you didn't have any money or any kind of way to get any money from anywhere. And that's how it hit the community so bad, because people started to when they didn't have any more money, they would start going to the family members and borrowing money. And then when they could no longer borrow money, they would start taking money and taking items and doing anything to get more crack. It's the worst thing to ever hit the community. I think it's much worse than heroin or anything else, because it's like it was not a physical addiction, it's a mental addiction. So it's like you just can't, you can never get enough. You just go on and on until there's nothing left.
And you, Elaine, had used marijuana, you had used powder cocaine, and then you started using crack cocaine. So you're describing what this crack is, this feeling that you got from using crack is totally different from anything you experienced with weed or powder cocaine.
Right, right.
And how available was it in this community where you were in Charlotte? I mean, was it, you could get it on every corner? Just how available was it?
Well, at that point, it was being sold as powdered cocaine, and you had to process it to make it into a smokable form, which at first it was called freebasing. And then it seems like when white people started using it, it became crack. So I don't think it was ever meant to spill over into other communities. I think it was intended for it to be isolated into the Black community, because I think it had been smoked in South America, And I guess it was seeing how it devastated communities there, because anybody that touches it, it doesn't discriminate color, race, anything. It's like if you do it, it's going to get you. It's a terrible thing.
What was the difference in the cost at the time? Like, was it cheaper to buy crack than it was to buy powder cocaine?
No, no, it wasn't. It was about the same. It's just that you had to process it from one form to another. But you could buy doses of crack where they didn't sell doses of powder. They would sell amounts that were higher than single doses. So the crack was like you could get a $2 hit of crack, but you couldn't buy a $2 bag of powdered cocaine. It
So
would
you
be
could buy smaller
at
quantities
least,
of the
yeah,
crack.
yeah, which
And,
made it more available. So that means that anybody could buy it, because you could get, like I say, down to a $2 hit.
and so by what year would you say that you were addicted to crack, Elaine?
I said 78, 77, and 78.
And how long did that addiction last?
Like 30, 40 years. uh, till 2011. 2011.
Wow.
I've been clean since 2011 now.
Wow. Congratulations on that. That's
Thank
just
you.
amazing. I'm just so happy for you. Just obviously we've all seen how difficult it is to kick an addiction. So, bravo to you for doing that. What
Thank you.
kinds of things? How did your life change, Elaine? Here you are, promising young student coming out of college, started law school, then became an entrepreneur, opened your own business. What changed in your life once you got addicted to crack?
Um, Nothing mattered but the crack. Nothing mattered anymore. Family, friends. I would try to stay away from them. I didn't want to bring any harm to anybody I knew, especially my family. So I stayed away from. I didn't like go to them for money or anything. Like I said, I started selling it, so that's how I supported my habit for many years, selling it. But it wasn't always good times. It was bad times with that too. So it was a lot of ups and downs in my life. I lost everything. I lost my car. I lost my condo, everything. And I was like living from day to day. But when you're living like that, you're living in a box. You don't even realize that you're doing as bad as you're doing. As long as you're able to get some more drugs, it's like you're on top of the world. So it's like a daily thing.
So let's talk about, you mentioned a couple of times, Elaine, that you started selling first weed and then crack. And we know that at some point you were arrested and you
Yes.
actually served time for drug offense. When were you first arrested?
1989.
And what was that arrest for?
It was a federal conspiracy to distribute cocaine charge. I
And
had 10 other co-defendants. And, if you know anything about the war on drugs, you know how that conspiracy popped in. So
yeah, I was going to say the conspiracy. So were you brought in because you were carrying the drugs, or you were caught, on a phone call communicating about drugs? What was your involvement in this 10-person conspiracy?
they had sent someone in to infiltrate the people that I dealt with. It wasn't like we were that. It's not like we conspired and worked together. It's just that when they get you on a conspiracy, if they get one person for the drugs, then they'll run down everybody like that person knows or comes in contact with. So like if they're watching a house, whoever they see going to this house, they're gonna automatically just get them a conspiracy charge because that person inside the house sells drugs. So and that's how they get so many people, so many co-defendants on a case on a conspiracy charge. It's not that you were working as an organization. It's just that that's how they That's how they were doing it back in the 80s. It
Right.
was ruthless. It was really ruthless the way they were doing things.
So
Uh,
just by walking into the house or being affiliated
yeah,
with or
yeah,
knowing the person, you could get caught up in this federal conspiracy. So
right.
you get arrested in '89, you get this conspiracy charge, like you said, that was widely used as a part of the war on drugs, that was literally, capturing hundreds of thousands of black folks, primarily around the country. How much time did you get for that conspiracy charge?
I ended up with 100 months. It was 8 years, a little over 8 years.
For your first offense on a conspiracy charge?
Yes.
So was that under the maximum, the
Yeah. Well, actually, I had 169 months, and I had cooperated with the authorities, and they cut my time down by 69 months.
wow.
But yeah, they've given people life. It's lots of women were in there with me. They had life sentences for not even getting caught with any drugs. Just somebody saying that they did this or that.
So when you got arrested in '89, you didn't have any drugs on you,
No,
and they didn't catch you in the act of transferring drugs for money.
no, no,
And you didn't
no,
have any money, any weapons, or anything that
no.
suggested that you had traded drugs for money. But yet you got overall, well, close to 10 years initially. That got knocked down to 8 years because you cooperated.
Yes,
Wow. And did you serve those whole 8 years?
yes.
Wow.
Seven and a half.
And at the time, you were addicted. Any, conversations, any efforts to talk to you about, rehabilitation or diversion programs, or any way
No.
to divert you from prison to actually some kind of rehabilitation program,
Well, they offered some programs in prison, but it
but
was
not to avoid prison. You were doing
no.
the hard time.
Right, right, right.
Wow. What was that like? I mean, here you are again, college graduate, business owner, and you're serving 7.5 years on a drug charge, and you get caught with no drugs.
Right.
What was that like in prison for those 7 years?
It was horrible. It was horrible because I'm not really like a really bad person. I was just chasing the American dream when I was selling drugs, just like the Kennedys. They were selling illegal liquor, so I was selling illegal drugs. But they became presidents, and I became an inmate.
Wow.
So
And you said you served time with women who were doing life on
yeah,
conspiracy and drug charges.
yes,
Wow.
yeah.
At that time, was the driving, you mentioned, you were trying to make a living, but was that the driving force, you think, for you for selling the drugs? Was it money or was it your addiction?
It was my addiction.
Okay. So had you gotten some help with your addiction, we already know you're smart, you're bright, you're capable. You could have gone back to being a business owner.
Right.
Wow. So let's
See, like
fast.
now they don't even like now the people in the opioid um, thing that's going on. They don't even arrest them a lot of times. They're giving them treatment, but that's a different community.
Right.
They didn't offer us that in the black community when the crack epidemic hit. So
Wow. Let's
it,
fast forward, Elaine. You get out, and what's
mhm.
life like when you get out? Were you able to find a job? Were you able to get into any kind of treatment? What was life like when you got
no,
out?
no, I kind of went back to I couldn't find I couldn't find a job. I couldn't find anything that I would want to work at. I didn't want to take just any kind of job. So I it's kind of like when once you get in the system, you pretty much stuck. Now recently there are programs that are coming up now with dealing with reentry and helping people coming out of prison. But back then there was nothing. It was just like you got that black mark on you, where you're a felon and you're ex-con and all these terms they throw on you. So no, it's hard. It's hard. I'm fortunate to have had a home to live in because housing would have been hard to get to. So I've never been homeless, but I've suffered from addiction for many years. And I was in a program. They put me in a program one time, and I said the wrong thing, and they kicked me out of the program. So that's that was the only thing.
Wow.
That was the only time that I was offered uh, a program,
Program.
to
How long
keep.
did you went? That wasn't in '89. That wasn't your only time actually being arrested and charged and incarcerated, was it?
No, no.
So
I
how
was
long were you out before you got arrested again?
uh well, I was out a couple years, got arrested, but I didn't do time until like a couple years later.
So you go back to jail in the mid '90s.
No, no, I was in I was in I was in the Fed the whole '90s almost, like to '97. Then I violated and I had to go back for like 9 months. But then I got state time in the 2000s, and I just finished, was just released back in November from 2011.
So in 2011, you went to a state prison and you just were released in 2020.
19, yeah, yeah, 2020. My I was at a halfway house in 2019, but I was all the way released in 2020.
So you did another 8 years in state prison.
Yeah, I did.
And what was that charge for?
It was for drugs and it was for some financial crimes, checks, counterfeit checks, and stuff like that.
And by the time you go in 2011, are you still addicted, or have
Yes,
you been
that
able to?
was my last time. Right before I was arrested, right before I went to prison, um, that was the last I did any kind of drugs, any
Wow.
cocaine.
Okay. What has release been like for you since you've been out?
Oh well,
Along-
they have a lots of resources now, so I've been doing pretty well. I got a job when I was in the halfway house, and so I kept that job until recently. But I've been taking trainings. I was able to take peer support training, so now I'm a peer support specialist at a respite here in Charlotte, and I'm doing well right now. I'm doing well.
Oh, that's great. Have you been able to? I know you said, when you were doing drugs and selling drugs, you really isolated yourself from your family. Have you been
Yes,
able to get reunited with your family and, you know, smooth over some of those relationships that perhaps were frayed during that period when you were using?
yes, yes, I have.
And what do you want people to know, Elaine? You've had, you've been through, as you said, a lot of ups and downs, pretty difficult time over the last 30, 40 years. Clearly, as you said, you're not a bad person. And unfortunately, we know the war on drugs in the 80s was framed as, the bad people versus good people, and bad people use drugs and good people just say no. We know that that was a flawed strategy. We know that, it's a really complex set of factors that go into how people get addicted to drugs and even start selling drugs. So what do you want people to learn from you sharing your story?
I just want people to know, don't get involved in the system. Whatever you do, just try something. There are a lot of programs out here where you can get help. Um, don't get caught up in that system because there's no out in it. And like I just wanted to say, like, it was a intentional thing by the government because they took the leadership when they in the '80s, late '80s and '90s. They took all of the leadership. They took all of the mamas and papas off the street. So that's why things are so bad now because these kids had to raise themselves. And we have like a street life and we have a regular people life in the black community. And so you the street life is very important. It's not now it's so much violence and stuff that people don't understand that. But back then, at least nobody went hungry. Everybody was taken care of. Even if somebody was selling drugs, they would throw feed people that needed it and get Christmas gifts for kids that had nobody to get them for them and all that kind of stuff. But when they took all of those people off the streets, the community really paid for it.
And what do you wish you going the government, Ronald Reagan in the 80s, Nancy Reagan, other legislators, elected officials, What do you wish they had known about you and your community? What did they
Oh,
do
they
wrong?
would have. I don't think they would have cared anything about that. I think they knew what they were doing. They knew what they were doing. Everything is planned around here.
Mm, okay. So you don't think it would have mattered had
No,
they known more about you and how
no,
talented you were and how capable you were? You don't think they would have realized that incarceration wasn't the way to address that issue, that you could have benefited and so many people like you could have benefited from rehabilitation and programs.
right. Well, they just, it's all about the dollar. The votes. They wanted votes, and that's what they get for making up these wars and all of this stuff. You said it was 50. It's been 50 years now.
It's 50 years,
Wow.
a lifetime. I mean, a lifetime.
Yeah.
Well, Elaine, you are living proof that it doesn't, matter where you start. You can end in so many different and incredible places. And again, just congratulations to you on your sobriety. Congratulations on getting a job and being able to reunite with your family. And really being able to come out on the other side of that and share your story in a way that hopefully will inspire so many others.
All
I
right.
really appreciate you sitting down with me this morning.
All right. Thank you for having me.
All right. My next guest is Dr. Reverend Mark Whitlock. He is the senior pastor at Reed Temple AME Church in Washington, in the Maryland area. But in the 1980s, he was in Los Angeles closing down crack houses and working in the Black community to address the very issues we just talked about with Elaine. Good morning and welcome, Dr. Whitlock.
Hello, my friend. You and I have known each other for a while. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for this opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, Reverend Mark, Reverend Whitlock. I'm going to go back and forth with a lot of different names because you're right, we
That's
are
okay.
friends. Just a pleasure to have you on. I thought about you because we were members of a church in Los Angeles. I'm still a member. You've moved on to do some great things in the
Thanks.
organization. But it was a church that was intimately involved in communities, not in Charlotte, but in Los Angeles, very similar to the one that Elaine talked about.
Yeah.
What do you remember most about those 80s and the crack epidemic as it hit LA?
First of all, let me make sure Elaine hears me. Elaine, I'm so proud of you. I'm so wonderfully happy for you. You were articulate. You were sharp. You shared your story. And I was over here crying and shouting because praise God for your sobriety. To be honest with you, it was the 1988 case, if you recall, the Dalton case, where they go into a house, the police, LAPD, goes into a house, and they break this house up thinking there's drugs and all kinds of things and disrupt this family. And what it did was it sent a message to Cecil Murray and myself, ministers at First AME Church, that this, lock them up, put them away is not the solution. We cannot arrest our way into sobriety. You can't arrest your way into an economic movement that was taking place, fueled by government money, made money in the banking industry, made money for real estate people, because if you talk to Freeway Rick, one of the greatest drug dealers in South LA, he owned millions, multi-millions of properties. So somebody made a commission, somebody made a loan, somebody made a profit. So when that case took place, we said we got to do something, because we still see the strawberries. And that's a woman who was a transactional drug addict. She talked about you can buy a hit. So we had women that were called strawberries that would walk on the street, perform sexual acts for less than $5 so they can get a hit. We had men and women in our congregation, lawyers, doctors, stretched out on crack cocaine because they could afford it, but they didn't understand the addictive properties, following Richard Pryor's wonderful Fire Running Down the Street. And so here we find the upper echelon who are playing with the drug, but it's becoming addicted to the drug. And now we're seeing it migrate, go into the Black community. And so after that Dalton case, we said, we got to go into the community. We're going to pull men together, and we're going to also work with the police. And we put together about 50, 60 brothers, men, Black men, along with the police. And we said, we're going to march in the community. Do you know what we found out?
No.
We marched in the community. You know what we found out? We found out we had 2 rock houses and properties the church owned.
Wow.
People were selling crack out of the window of church-owned property. We lived as we were walking in the community, walking down the street. We walked up to one of our properties. We saw a car pull up, white boy, white girl, maybe 18, maybe 21. And the window goes up, boom, the package goes in the car. And we walked up and said, whoa, what's up with this? Now, we were absolutely crazy. We walked up singing, "We on the battlefield for the Lord," loud. We didn't close eyes when we prayed, but we made a lot of noise. We made a lot of noise because most of us were in corporate America. We had to go back to work the next day. We wasn't crazy. And so we marched. And when we started marching, you know what happened? Not only did we take pictures of the white kids coming into the black neighborhood to buy their drugs, but what happened was, when we started marching in the community late at night, starting at 7, finishing up about 12 midnight, sometimes later, we marched on the community, we on the battlefield for the Lord. What happened was it disrupted the commerce, it disrupted the business. So the strawberries wouldn't come to the house because them church people, them crazy church people down there. And we discovered that not only did we have 2 rock houses owned by property owned by the church, these were apartment buildings, but we had a total of 13 rock houses right around less than a mile radius of the church. So we would march around the houses every night, circle the houses, pray. Within 3 years, we closed 13 rock houses, according to the LAPD, Captain Zimmerman, who was on parole at the time. What we did was we didn't just close rock house, close business, because they can easily pick up and go to another neighborhood. We understood that. What we did was, not only did we work with then who becomes the mayor, but he was the city attorney. Hahn was the city attorney. So we seized the property, took hold of the property, not the church, but the city took hold of the property because of the fallacious and illegal drug that were taking place. So that hurt them economically. Number 2, we then began to minister to the addicts in the community, sending the treatment programs, because we had a real shortage. We had no place. Black folk didn't have jobs enough. We didn't have insurance enough to pay for the recovery. We didn't have recovery centers. We didn't have clinics. All they had was a jail or a prison, and they would be released back into the same neighborhoods that they came out of. So the recidivism rate was 70, 80%. So as we close in rock houses, now we're bringing these young men, creating jobs for them, creating a new mindset for them, women creating a new mindset for them. And we found out at First AME Church, we had 300 young people who now said, I am my name and I am an alcoholic, I am a drug addict. They would meet every Friday at First AME Church, and we had 300, sometimes as many as 500 of them young people up there. I am a drug addict. I have been clean for 30 days. I have been clean for 60 days. I have been clean for 90 days. Then we began to help them with their educational goals, find a way to get them some scholarships, find a way to get them back into school, find a way to get an expungement for their record, find a way to encourage them, to let them know they're not defined by their economic status, but they are defined by who God made them to be. They are great. You know what? It worked. It worked.
And, you know, I want to thank you for sharing that, Pastor Whitlock, because we heard Elaine say that there weren't programs in her community for her when she first got home from that first 8 years she did in the federal penitentiary. I want to bring in Nikechi Taifa. She is the founder of the Taifa Group, a human rights attorney and an author of several books, including Black Power, Black Lawyer, My Audacious Quest for Justice. She's also a senior fellow for the Center of Justice at Columbia University.
Hey.
Good morning.
Morning.
Pronouncing your name right?
Yeah, it's good. I pronounce it Nikechi. Nikechi Taifa.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Nikechi. Nikechi, you're a lawyer, and you heard Elaine talk about, the conspiracy charge and how the conspiracy charges were used in the 80s to, if you were walking into what was defined as a crack house, if you were standing on the corner, if you were caught on a telephone. She did 7.5, almost 8 years, got caught, no drugs on her, no money on her, nobody witnessing her exchanging, money for drugs, but yet she did that because she got caught up in this 10-person conspiracy indictment. How are those indictments being used in the 80s to, put away people like Elaine who, from what we think of as a legal case, really weak legal case on drugs.
Well, absolutely. It's really what has caused the astronomical rise in convictions and incarcerations, what has led to mass incarceration. We are in the 50th year of the war on drugs. And in 1986, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act was passed, which had all this proliferation of mandatory minimum sentences. And then a couple of years later, in 1988, the conspiracy charges were added to the federal bill. And it's just the system just absolutely and completely exploded. There was no direct connection with respect to illegality. Just anybody could be, you could make a phone call, or things that, Elaine said. You could just be a girlfriend, okay? And people, low-level first-time offenders, oftentimes receiving longer sentences than big-time drug so-called kingpins. That's what happened with Alice Marie Johnson, a dear friend of mine, who was passed over for clemency during the Obama administration. She was a very low-level person. Kimber Smith was a girlfriend of a drug dealer. She was scared to come forward about his drug dealing. And when he finally was killed, when she came forward, they smacked her with a 24-and-a-half-year sentence, even though the judge and the prosecutor agreed that she never used or handled any drugs. It was the conspiracy charges that ended up dealing with that. We are just now trying to come out from under those harsh penalties that became exacerbated during the 80s, continued into the 90s with the crime bill of 1994, which I call under Bill Clinton. There was no difference between Republicans and Democrats when it came to criminal justice. Everybody was talking about tough on crime. We dug ourselves into a corner that we find ourselves in, having the largest incarceration rate in the world. It's got to stop.
Yeah, they deal with the symptom and not the systematic racism that leads to the need to self-medicate. I'll be quiet. Let me listen to you, Sister Martin.
No, that was a great point, Reverend Whitlock and Nikechi. One of the things that really just is so devastating is this woman, Elaine, first-time offender.
Right.
And an addict, drug addict who was selling drugs. And what she went to jail for wasn't even really selling drugs. She had sold drugs and she acknowledged that, but was doing it for her addiction.
And to get through school.
Yeah. And she said,
and that's the problem.
Was there any sense in the 80s that maybe we should be treating the addiction rather than criminalizing this conduct?
It was a law enforcement punitive approach that was used during that time. That's what the Just Say No was all about, a simplistic solution to dealing with very real problems. Instead of pouring money into prevention and treatment, what money was being poured into was just say no. Shall we say?
My challenge is we're not treating the pharmaceutical companies the same way we treat the drug salesmen on the street, or even better, the Noriegas in South America. The reality is the new drug are the opiates. The new drug is the white kid's drug, and 80% of the overdoses are white. 90% of the addictions are white, and they now have insurance, they have treatment programs, they have everything else. And what the sister Elaine was saying was, we didn't treat them the same way. But when I was pastoring in Orange County, I was talking to the sheriff. He said, Mark, at least $5 to $20 million rolls down the freeway every day with painkillers that the white kids are taking, and they're becoming addicted, and nobody's talking about it.
Yeah, I do want to ask though, in the 80s, you were a human rights lawyer, civil rights lawyer. I think of you. The difference in sentencing. The white kid that Reverend Whitlock is talking about that maybe got arrested with powder cocaine, and the black, kid in a black community who has the rock cocaine. Help us understand the gross disparity in terms of what we saw as it relates to sentencing differences.
So when I first started working on these issues, I thought that the reason why all the young black youth were being herded into prison is because blacks use crack more often than whites. That's what I saw on the media. That's what I heard in the newspapers and the like. But when I went and did the research, I found out that that absolutely was not the case. In fact, what I found out from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, that whites did more crack than black. And so I'm thinking about, well, why is it that Tyrone and Tronika and everybody is being herded into prison? It's because of the law enforcement deployment, the way they determined where the resources, law enforcement resources were going to be deployed. And they determined it was going to be in the black community, not in the universities where drugs were going on, but to Tyrone standing on the corner who basically had a sign on his back. And then the disparity in the sentences, it was not just law enforcement resources. It wasn't just prosecutorial discretion and the way they used their discretion. It was the laws that were passed, facially neutral laws, but laws that had a disproportionate impact on black and other people of color. Laws that said that 5 grams of crack cocaine, the weight of a couple of packs of sugar, carries the same 5-year sentence as 500 grams of powder cocaine. Something's not quite right with that statistic, but that had been the law all the way up until we finally got it eased just a little bit in 2010, where the disparity, but the 100-to-1 disparity between crack and powder cocaine was reduced to 18-to-1. And we're still now in 2021 trying to get that disparity eliminated completely.
Elaine is back. I don't know, Rashad, can you bring Elaine's camera back up? I don't know if he's going to work on that, Elaine.
I just wanted to interject something. They find drugs where they look for drugs.
Come on.
They don't look for drugs in the white community.
Come on.
They come to our communities and buy and then run back home.
Did we say that it's bias policing? When you talk about Black Lives Matter, I mean, if we don't deal with this bias policing, as well as the biased prosecutors, biased judges, and biased lawmakers, Congress as well as Senate, we saw the insurrection of June 6th. If we don't deal with that, then we'll continue to say the symptom is black people, but the problem is the victims are black people, and we have to deal with the systematic racism that exists.
Exactly. And I wanted to say one more thing with the crack law. They would even find black people with powdered cocaine,
Lord,
charge them, saying that they were going to cook it up. They would charge them. They would be caught with powder, but charged with crack because they said they were going to cook the dope up. And
actually, Elaine is absolutely correct. I know of a case where there was an undercover female agent going to a famous sports person, basically saying, okay, I need you to cook this powder into crack and then I'll buy it. So he had it cooked into crack. She bought it and then put him in prison. I mean, I'm just saying that the tactics that were being used were just absolutely abysmal.
Right.
Well,
they were going to prison.
I'm running out of time. This subject obviously touches such a nerve. This is why we're dedicating this whole week to this war, this 50th anniversary, looking at the failed policies that have been implemented for over 5 decades and the impact on the Black community. Thank you so much, Reverend Whitlock. Thank you, Nikechi, for the work that you're doing. Thank you, Elaine, so much for sharing your story. Godspeed to all of you. Just such an interesting conversation. Obviously, we could spend hours and hours on this.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. Okay, moving on. My next guest is Dr. Samuel Roberts. He's an associate professor at Columbia University and former director of Columbia University's Institute for Research in African American Studies. He's also the author of Infectious Fear, Politics, Disease, and the Health Effects of Segregation. Good morning, Dr. Roberts.
Hey, good morning, Areva. How are you?
I'm great. You heard this conversation, and obviously,
I am disappointed that I couldn't join in on it. That was a brilliant conversation. I enjoyed it off stage, so to speak. So yeah, thank you for letting me hear that.
I thought about trying to bring you on, but my producer would have killed me if I'd asked him to unplanned add a 5th guest to the show. But you're here now. Help us understand. We're talking about 50 years, going back to Nixon. And some theorize that Nixon saw 2 enemies. He saw the hippies who were primarily using marijuana, and he saw African Americans who were voting Democratic and who were protesting the Vietnam War. And he wanted to take aim at both of those groups. And the way he did that was to declare this war on drugs. How accurate is that depiction?
I think it's very accurate. And I would even take that a bit further. I think what we should remember about the 1960s and 70s is that in our history, this was a period where we saw a very strong alliance between African Americans, the labor movement, other rights movements, gay liberation, women's liberation, economic rights, et cetera, and the Democratic Party. This was the kind of foundation of a really strong alliance of governance. And the Republican strategy, starting, as you said, with Nixon and the silent majority campaign, but then also, again, with Reagan and his anti-welfarism and his drug warriorism, is the strategy is to put a chisel into that alliance. So this is a political strategy. It's an electoral strategy. I think I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that if this were a drug enforcement or a law enforcement strategy, it's obviously woefully failed, right? I mean, drugs persisted for 50 years later. Drug use persisted 50 years later. If this were a public health campaign, which it probably should have been, it certainly failed there as well. I would say that it's really part of an electoral campaign, among other things.
How is it, though, that Reagan, it seems like he came out smelling like a rose. He was applauded. He was lauded for this war on drugs. And it was bought into not just by whites, but African Americans leadership during the 1980s as well. It was widely accepted to be the way to address drugs in our community was this tough on crime, lock them up, throw away the key. I think Daryl Gates, the infamous police chief in Los Angeles during this time period, basically said, anyone caught, using drugs, selling drugs, should be put away for life. I mean, so this notion that drug addicts were, menaces to society and deserve to be, put into this other space. And then once you're an other, dehumanized and just put in jail and the key thrown away. How is it that we were celebrating that?
Well, I think it's a lot of things. First of all, and it's a big picture, and I'm gonna, I'll try not to give the big answer. But I think first of all, our cities were in economic crisis. Like the jobs were leaving. I don't call it white flight. I call it capital flight. The problem wasn't that the white people were leaving. The problem was that the capital was leaving. The jobs were leaving. The money was leaving. The wealth was leaving. And what you have is an economic vacuum. And into that steps drugs, right? You're either, as we saw with Elaine's, moving and riveting testimony, you may sell drugs as an economic strategy, or you may use as a psychological one, just to kind of ease some of the pain or trauma or just, boredom of life. What happens, however, is that when you have massive amounts of funding for a war on drugs, that becomes the only political economic game in town. So even if you are a Black elected official, and keep in mind, this is the 1980s, so we're into we're well into the period of our first Black mayors. Dinkins here in New York is in the late 80s, but you have Carl Stokes in Ohio and, all across the country of Black mayors, but they inherit these cities that are economically broken. And many of them are asking for federal assistance in education, in public health, in infrastructure, in healthcare generally. And the Congress, which, by the way, these are Democratic-run Congresses. We can blame Reagan, and we should, but there's plenty of blame to go around with the Democratic Party as well. Their response is, well, we've got a lot of drug war money. I don't know about that other stuff, but we can give you plenty of drug war money. And so that's, when all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. If all the money you have is just for fighting drugs, you really can't do anything else besides fighting drugs.
Yeah, and I guess the narrative has always been written that the response, the heavily militarized response, the 4,000 extra federal prosecutors, all the money that went into law enforcement was in response to the rise or the emergence of crack cocaine. But when you look historically, it wasn't in response. It was always a part of this planned strategy. How were they able to spin the narrative for so long to cause people to believe that they were responding to something rather than that this was a planned strategy being implemented?
I think that's an excellent question, and I'll confess now that I'm not sure I know the entirety of the answer. I would say, on one hand, this was a very skillful media campaign at a modern where we're really seeing the modern era of White House modern communications as well with Nixon. Prior to Nixon, I'm not sure we really had consultants and madmen, so to speak, who were really working in the White House. It's possible, but I think it's really around the 70s and 80s we start to see that. Certainly, Governor Rockefeller had advertising consultants when in anticipation of passing the Rockefeller drug laws here in New York State. So I think there's ways in which those mythologies persisted even till today. We have people who still believe in some of them, partly or in large part because of spin and an ignorance of the evidence that we did have. We did know that in the American public, concern over drugs in 1970 was not as high as concern over the economy or concern over Vietnam. But Nixon pivoted in 1970, 1971 to make it about drugs. Reagan did the same. It connected, welfare queens, as he called them, his assault on Black women, which was certainly attached to assault on reproductive justice, also to drug warriorism, which basically, I was about to say implied, but actually was very explicit that Black people are a drain on the system. They're either, drug sellers, drug users, welfare queens, et cetera, et cetera. So it's an electoral strategy, which was, very skillfully crafted, I would say.
Yeah, and Nikechi is still there. So if you can bring her camera back on, Rashada, let's bring her back into this conversation. One thing that this war became, Professor, was this moralizing. As you said, Blacks were a drain on society. It became this simplistic. If you did drugs, you were bad. If you could say no to drugs, you were good. But Nikechi, in the work that you did and the research you've done, when did people start to realize that this war on drugs was also an assault on the Black community? Did they know that from the beginning with Nixon in the 70s? Did they know it in the 80s with Reagan? Did it take us to see Nancy, who wasn't a researcher, a scientist, a sociologist, or a doctor, try to preach to us about drugs? When did we know that this was about race?
Well, actually, some of us knew it for a long time. Long before Michelle Alexander came out with the new Jim Crow, a lot of us were comparing what was happening with the drug law with earlier forms of social control. The general public knew that there was something, but there was no real proof. Until 1994, when Nixon's domestic policy advisor from back in the 70s was quoted as saying what you said earlier, Areva, that we knew it was wrong. We intentionally was comparing the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and we would use that to vilify them both on the evening news night after night, to arrest their leaders, to break up the meetings, etc. So it wasn't until 1994 that there was actual proof that this actually was a strategy that they knew was a racially motivated, scenario. So now we're in the situation where we have a President Biden who was one of the chief architects of the crime bill of 1994, saying we do need a different type of approach. Okay. The problem is people have been in prison, some for like almost 50 years, 30, 40, 50 years under these draconian laws. And coming out of that, it's not as easy as it seems. I've been in the legislative realm trying to get legislation passed. It's a long process. We're trying to appeal to the Biden administration now for those people who were released under the CARES Act to come out as a result of the coronavirus, that they not have to go back to prison when the pandemic is over. We have people sitting in prison on marijuana offenses, and the laws on marijuana are changing all over the country. People making huge amounts of money with respect to marijuana, and we have nonviolent marijuana people convicted of that sitting in prison, and many of these people with these drug offenses are disproportionately Black.
And you mentioned Nixon's aide, Professor Roberts. She's talking about John Ehrlichman, who admitted in an interview with Harper Magazine that the strategy, was well orchestrated and not a response to any emergence of drugs. And you point out accurately that the American public wasn't focused on this so-called drug crisis and demanding that the government take action. But Nikechi said that we knew pretty early on that it was race. So I know we have the emergence of these black mayors in the 1980s. I'm sure we had, folks like you in academia talking about the racial component of this war. But were black folks in these positions of power raising their hands saying, wait a minute, this is a racially motivated policy and we've got to, pump the brakes on this? Who was saying that at the time, if anyone?
I mean, the historical record isn't entirely clear with that, right? On one hand, there were many people in black communities who said, oh, yeah, this definitely seems like a setup. I mean, you can't really live until 1989, for example, and not notice that, most of the SWAT raids are in black neighborhoods. Keeping in mind that the SWAT teams were invented in the 60s and used very rarely and usually only for hostage situations. The first ones were on the Black Panthers, in fact, but they have been designed for other purposes. And then by the 1980s, 1990s, they're almost exclusively for drug raids in black and brown communities. So I don't think you could have gone that long and not noticed that. On the other hand, our elected officials and our civic leaders, unfortunately, were very, late to ascertain that. They, some of our, some politicians who we hold up as, towering figures were actually drug warriors. Charlie Rangel chaired the narcotics committee in the Congress, in a democratically led Congress. And he was, lauded on the cover of Ebony magazine as, America's top drug warrior. We have to really scrutinize the historical record of our elected officials and our civic leaders as well, our private sector leaders too.
And Nikechi, you mentioned Michelle Alexander's, incredible book. We know that the prison population from 1975, starting, through the 2000s, exploded. I saw a number like 240,000 to like 1.4 million people, and 1 in 5 incarcerated people who were there for drug offenses were African American. So we get this result of this war on drugs, starts with Nixon, goes through the Reagan era, and now we have literally hundreds of thousands of black men. I think Congresswoman Cori Bush from Missouri said in one period, 40 to 50 people that she knew in her immediate family and friend circles were either dead or out of her community because of drug offenses. 40 to 50 people. I mean, help us put in perspective, that mass incarceration, the locking up, the impact that it had. Elaine said, moving mamas and papas from our community.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to make sure we know it wasn't just men, because with the conspiracy charges that Elaine talked about, it brought so many women into the system as well. Folks need to understand that the mass incarceration, the roots went far, far greater and far, far deeper than just arrest and incarceration, impacting every element of life. Education, Pell Grants were taken away, the franchise, the voting rights, public benefits, immigration, child welfare, every housing
housing
impacted by the drug war.
And let me just note about housing. You remember the policies where you came back from jail, now you're a felon, you couldn't even live in federally subsidized housing. So that created, massive homelessness and separations of families that was just, horrific.
Absolutely.
And it's perfectly legal to, if you're a landlord, to ask a prospective tenant, check this box if you have a felony record. So you're blocked out of public housing and private housing.
And
sorry, Nikechi.
That's okay. If grandma is in public housing and young Tyrone wants to come stay with her and he has some drug charge, grandma is put out of public housing and she had nothing to do with the drugs herself. It's just, yeah.
Yeah, guys, we got to leave it there. I'm out of time, but such an interesting conversation. I can't thank you enough. We're doing a whole series on this. There's so much to cover. You've hit on that, emphasis 1994 crime bill. On Wednesday, we're going to be back at this, and we're going to go into the 90s, and we're going to talk about Bill Clinton, and we're going to talk about those black legislators and religious leaders who were standing up, in favor of that 1994 crime bill, including our very own President Biden. Again, thank you so much for all of your work, Dr. Roberts and Nikechi, just doing phenomenal work, helping us understand this history and helping us change it. More importantly.
You too, Areva. Thank you so much for your work. Been a fan for a long time. So good to find you on the show. Thank you. And good to see you as well, Nikechi.
Good to see you again, too.
Absolutely. I just want to thank all of my guests. What an interesting conversation. I read an article talking about the 50-year anniversary of the war on drugs, and it was so interesting to me. We were going to try to do this show in one episode, and it became clear to me that this war on drugs spanning 50 years is so massive that we couldn't do it justice in just one show. So we'll be back at it on Wednesday. We'll be back at it on Friday. We touched upon some of the themes we're going to cover on Wednesday and Friday, but I think it's very clear that this failed policy on drugs ripped family members, mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles out of the Black community, caused people like Elaine, who had promising futures and who were addicted to drugs, to spend the better part of their lives in both federal and state prisons. And unlike the programs that Elaine has been able to avail herself of with her recent release, those programs weren't available because pretty much our federal budget during this period of the 70s and 80s was dedicated to law enforcement, this lock them up, this tough on crime, this throw away the key policies that we, I'd like to say that we now know was so flawed, but it's pretty clear that even at the time that it was being implemented, there were lots of people in positions of power that understood how sinister it was and how racially motivated these policies were, but yet they were being applauded by Blacks and whites alike. So much to learn from the 70s and the 80s and the so-called war on drugs. Just some words to live by before I get out. Just say no to drugs. In 1985, Nancy Reagan, our then First Lady, said, "Our job is never easy because drug criminals are ingenious. They work every day to plot a new and better way to steal our children's lives, just as they've done by developing this new drug called crack. For every door that we close, they open a new door." And then, wait for it, came her famous line, "Say yes to your life, and when it comes to drugs and alcohol, just say no." This famous punchline was the cultural, family-oriented prong of her husband's assault on the drug problem. The problem was just saying no to drugs didn't work. DARE, the most widespread educational program operating under the Just Say No philosophy, was a failure at dissuading young people from doing drugs. The program brought law enforcement officers into classrooms, and once there, instead of convincing kids not to use drugs, the hysteria around drugs used by young people helped to create some of the most destructive mechanisms of mass incarceration. Fears of children getting addicted to drugs gave rise to the school to prison pipeline. At the same time, resources from health agencies, from rehabilitation and healthcare agencies were being shifted to the Department of Justice for law enforcement and the criminalization of casual drug users and even low-level offenders. The Just Say No campaign was an oversimplification of an increasingly complex issue that perpetuated the myth that drug addiction is a choice. It created this national dialogue where there were good people who made good choices saying no to drugs, and then there were bad people whose bad choices of addiction should be criminalized. The policies dehumanized addicts and made them into others that deserve to be incarcerated. It also removed crucial members, parents, spouses, friends, and employees from communities and returned them without resources or support. Nancy Reagan knew nothing about drug addiction. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't a researcher, a sociologist, a scientist. She was an actress, a socialite. And she was sorely mistaken and naive about drug addiction. Addiction isn't some kind of moral failure or choice. It's an illness rooted in social, environmental, and biological factors. It takes more than 50 years for experts to accept this. It's taken more than 50 years for experts to accept this. And even after 50 years, we are finally saying no to just say no. Make sure you join us for part 2 of the War on Drugs on Wednesday and join us on Friday for part 3. I'm safe. I'm out, y'all. Be safe out there. Don't forget to wear your mask. And remember, we are all in this together. I am safe. Take care. Bye-bye.